Welcome back to Getting Started with JavaScript, Chapter 9, and this is going to be Session 2. In Session 2, we're going to start understanding a little bit more about objects and how things get done in JavaScript using the different tools that we have at our resources. Let's get started. You've probably heard about object-oriented languages. JavaScript is not technically an object-oriented language, but it is an object-based language. JavaScript is based on the concept of objects, and those objects have attributes, and they have methods, and they have functions associated with them. They also have children inside of them, parents, similar to our HTML where we have nesting and we have parents and children. So understanding that JavaScript is an object-based language. There are built-in objects, there are browser objects, document objects, and customized objects. So each of these we're going to be working with a little bit differently. There are two different parts that are important. First is the browser object model, which is the BOM, and the document object model, which is the DOM. And the DOM is where most of your HTML objects are going to be. Inside of our window, inside of our document is where all of your HTML is going to be hiding. And we're going to be able to get in there into those children of the document to be able to access things, modify things, change things around with our code. When you want to access something directly down, so a child directly, you're going to use a period. So in this case, I could say window, period, document, period, images. And that's going to get me down to the images objects, which is a list of images that are inside of your document. Each of the objects are organized into groups that we call collections, object collections. And the examples that we've listed here are your anchors, your applets, so on and so forth, your forms, your frames, your images. However, we don't generally walk all the way down there because there's this really awesome function in documents called getElementById. You wondered why we spent all this energy writing IDs for all of our HTML elements? That's for this purposes. You can reference your document, and you can just say document. It knows that it's the Windows document. So you can say document, and you can say period, getElementById, and then include the ID name of that element inside of the parentheses. This is going to allow you to get an instance of that element object, which you can then access as well. So I can access the value inside of it or the inner HTML. I can access any of the attributes that go along with it. Its CSS class, or any of the, what type of object is it? What type of element is it? You can also use getElements_by_class_name. Remember, classes can have more than one element. So this does not return a single element. This returns an array of elements. We'll talk about arrays in Chapter 10. But this is a group or a collection of elements that the by class name returns. Whereas the ID, remember, every ID has to be unique. The ID is going to be a singular value. We're going to use this through a lot of this code to make sure that we can change things in our HTML. So as I said, we can change our values or properties and methods of given objects. In this case, we have an element called first name, and that element has a value. It's probably an input tag. And in this case, we can change that to a specific string value. You can do this by saying document getElementById, find the ID number, then you have a reference to that object. We can then use the dot operator to get attributes of that object. So if you think about the getElementById is returning the value of an object, it's returning the object itself, and then we're going to use that period to get the attribute called value. You can use your JavaScript to modify attributes or properties, although remember, there are some attributes and properties that are read-only. You can't always change things. You can usually get them, so I can use document getElementById first name dot value to get the value. So I could say variable x equals, and we'll talk about variables in a second. Or I can set it in this instance. There's also things called methods or functions that go along with those objects. Different objects have different methods, so it's not like there's a constant list that everything has the same methods on it. In this case, the window object has a method called alert. The alert takes a single text parameter, so just string for its parameter, and it displays that in an alert box, which we've seen. So that's a method that is being called on the window object. recognizing how those methods work and attributes work. Attributes are usually a singular value, whereas a method is something that does something. It alters that object or modifies that object or changes something. One of the really useful properties in HTML is what we call our inner HTML. If you think of the HTML element as it has a tag, usually an opening and closing tag, and then in between the opening and closing tag is a series of other things. That can be HTML or that can be just text, both of which exist inside of those tags. Inner HTML gets you everything that is in between those tags, HTML or text, and either returns or sets that value. In this example here, the inner HTML, I have an ID called test, and my inner HTML is, this is my inner bold HTML, close bold. That's how that's set up. So that's your inner HTML. Outer HTML is everything inside of inner HTML, including the element tags, if you need the element tags. So if you want to do that, you can use outer HTML. There is also an attribute called text content. This is just the text. There's no HTML text in this, HTML tags. So it's just text, and we can just modify the text content. You can do this if you know there's no HTML in there and you don't care and you just want to deal with text and you don't want to deal with any tags. You can use your text content similar to your inner HTML. It just doesn't have any HTML in it. You can also write HTML directly to your document. Now this is, you have to be careful with this one. So with document write, we can write HTML directly into the document. However, if it is done before the HTML is loaded, all of the following HTML will get appended to the end of it. If it is done at the end, so if we write the code at the end or we use the defer to run this at the end, it will replace any HTML code. So if we want to replace it, we can use document write and then add some text, and it will just replace all of the HTML with whatever I put in there. If we do the script at the end, if we do the script at the beginning, it will go ahead and load the rest of the HTML as expected. We can also do something called insert adjacent HTML, which puts it in a specific position as opposed to replacing everything. It just puts it in wherever we ask it to be. So whatever that position tends to be. Okay, let's look at adding some HTML code. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and start working with some of our code. I'm going to go ahead and pull the Windows alert out because I don't need it in there. And we're going to start adding some details to our page. So if we look at our page over here, we see that there are a couple of things we need to change. First off, the current time. It is not November 3rd of 2017 at this time. The amount of days left until New Year's Eve is not this, because that doesn't make any sense. So we're going to start modifying some of our HTML with our JavaScript. So I'm going to kind of keep that open so you can see the script page here. And we're going to go ahead and add in some HTML. First, we're going to display the current date and time. And I'm using comments here. Comments are good. We like our comments. And we are going to set our document object dot get element by ID. When we get element by ID as opposed to by class name, we are actually looking for, if we come back over here, the ID here that is going to tell us what is the date now. See this date now here? And we are going to change that date now. And it's currently showing the date and a break and then the time. So we're going to be changing that. So we're going to get the date now. Make sure you keep a track of your capitalization. This is what we call camel case, where it's lowercase to begin with and then uppercase for each additional word. So we're going to get our get element date now, and we are going to set the inner HTML. That's going to be a property of our date now, and it's going to be including all of the text that is inside of it. For right now, I'm just going to put in a placeholder here, month, day, year, and then I'm going to put in a break, and then I'm going to put hour, minute, second, just so that you can see how it's going to change that. So up here in our current time, instead of it saying 11:03, it's actually going to put in the letters MDY. We're going to change those to real numbers here in just a second. So when I hit refresh, you can see that's now MDY horizontal or hours, minutes, seconds. This object date now here now has its inner HTML exactly as I typed it. Really important to be able to see that you are changing the actual HTML between your two tags. Over in our area down here, the amount of time that's left, we have a couple of other things here. We have our ID of days, hours, minutes, and seconds. And these are the sections that we're also going to be changing to some filler text for right now. Here we are going to do 4 get elements, and then we're going to set their text content. So we're going to do our document, get element by ID, and we're going to look for the days element. Remember, we just looked at that. And we're going to set our text content. And we're just going to put in the letters DD. Let's do the same thing for hours, minutes, seconds. So you can see we added DD, HH, MM, and SS, and they're in the correct format, whatever the style was that we had selected for there. These are things that we're going to be filling in here with some numbers as we go along. As with any programming language, we have to talk about variables. Variables are the way that we store items to use them later, store values to use them later. Variables, just like in your intro to math class where you have a variable x and you do things with your x and you add 3 to your x and something along those lines, we are going to be creating a lot of variables in any language that we use for coding. In JavaScript, a couple of rules on variables. The first character must be a letter or an underscore. You may not start it with a number. Variables are case sensitive, which means a capital A and a lowercase a are 2 completely different variables, not the same variable. You cannot use any spaces or any special characters except the underscore. And you cannot use the keywords. I did not list the keywords here. There's a few of them, probably 30 or so, that you can't use. You can't use the word class. You can't use the word new. You can't use the word or and. Couple of keywords. It's important to know what those keywords are, and the more you work with programming, the more you'll recognize them as things go along. The word function is a keyword. Things along those lines. When you create a variable, you use the keyword var, V-A-R, for variable, before the variable name. Then you use an equal sign to assign the value or to set the value. So in this case, I have done a date div, which is the div element that I have that has date now, and I have set the variable date div equal to whatever that object is. Variables can be objects. So variables can be numeric or text. Boolean, which is just a true, false, yes, no, 1, 0, on or off. Generally, we think of Boolean as true, false. An object, and we'll talk about different objects as we go along, or the value null, which is nothing, which is not a value. There's nothing assigned to this, so null. Null is different than an empty string. So an empty string is an empty string. It's a string with no values in it, whereas null means nothing was assigned. Null is a very important coding term. JavaScript is what we call weakly typed, as in its type is not very strong. The other option is strongly typed. Its data type is implicit. In some languages, you will have the data type assigned when you create the variable. I would say integer, my number, or string first name, or something along those lines. But in JavaScript, it's weakly typed. It's implicit. It's understood by whatever value you put into the variable. So you do not have to give it a data type to begin with. That being said, good coding practice is to understand what the variable type is and to use it consistently. You may choose to put an I before any integer values or an str before any string values, just because it will understand that variable is a string type and you can use it appropriately as things go on. Once the variable is declared, you can now use it inside of your code. So in the example here with the date div, I now have the div object. Remember, that object has an attribute called inner HTML, and I can reference that attribute directly from the variable. The variable is now assigned to that object. So if you think about the variable as date div, it's an object that you can then do things with without having to type document.getElement by ID and the name every time. I can just assign it to a variable and then use that variable throughout my code. You'll see how we do this when we look through some code. We'll be working with lots of objects over the rest of this course, but for now, we're just going to talk about our date object. When you have an object and you want to create a new version of that object, so a new date, you need to use the new keyword and what we call a constructor. A constructor is generally the name of the object type, in this case date, with an open and closed parenthesis, or with some value in between those parentheses as a parameter. So the date object in this case has a couple of methods associated with it, both what we call getters and setters. So our getters will allow you to assign a new date either with a string, with a series of values, so year, month, day, hours, minutes, seconds, or a string value in some common understanding of what a date looks like. So you can see that there are two values here, one of which uses the slashes and one of those uses the words. They both work because JavaScript understands that's how dates are usually written. Once you have that object, this date, I can then call any of these methods to get some attributes about that date. So the methods get seconds, get minutes, or set full year, set hours, set minutes. And I can set those values with setters and I can get those values with getters. One of the things to remember with date objects, the day is fine. The year is usually fine. Hours, minutes, and seconds, those are all fine. But the month, 0 is the month for January and 11 is the month for December. That's because it's coming from an array that is 0 based, and we'll talk about arrays in chapter 10. So think about it. If you look at the month is always going to be one number off from what you expect the number to be. So you can see in the example here with the new date where we gave it the month of 1, that is February. The month of 0 is January. So remember with dates, that the month is always one number off because of how months are designed from 0 to 11. Let's look and see how we can modify some dates. All right, so we are going to go ahead and include up at the top, because we're going to be using it throughout our script, an actual variable to hold what is today, because we're going to need today to know what all of this information is. So we're going to make a variable, var. We're going to call it current day. Honestly, you could change it to anything that you want, but we're going to use current day because we're going to use that throughout. And then we're going to create a date object. When we create an object, we always use the new keyword with the name of the object, in this case, date. Now you'll see when I type in date, it gives me the option of a couple of different ways of doing my date. In this case, I'm actually going to set it to a specific date for the purposes of this lesson. We'll change this when we get towards the end. So I'm going to set this to May 23rd, 2018 at 14:35:05 seconds. Okay, so I now have a variable called current day, and I can use that variable in my code. If I refresh here, and I come over to my code here, I can get the value of this specific variable by adding it to my watch list. So here's my watch list here, and I can add current day to my watch list. You can see the value that is assigned to current day is Wednesday, March 23rd at 2018, 4:35:05 seconds. Having a watch list with your variables is really, really useful when you are running your code and testing it, because you want to be able to access that information really easily and look at the information you need. We're now going to be using our day to create a date string and a time string. So we're going to create two more variables. We're going to call it date string, and it is going to be equal to current day, and we're going to use the two local date string parentheses. Remember, local means that it's for this time zone as opposed to any other time zone. Again, we're going to do current day, and we're going to do two local time string. Now, each of these different strings is going to be a little bit different. If I hit reset right now, I can do another watch here, and I can do date string, which is 5:23, and time string, which is 2:35 p.m. So you can see how those strings were created with that 2 local date string, 2 local time string, and these 2 variables are there. We're now going to use those variables inside of our code over here to be able to populate for this month, day, year, and hours, minutes, and seconds. We are going to keep the break in between quotes, and we're going to take out the other 2. And then we are going to concatenate or add together our date string with our quotes and then our time string. Concatenation between strings in JavaScript is just the plus symbol. So by plussing together or adding together, it will mush together all of the strings that we have given. It will not include spaces. So if you do need a space, you need to add it within 2 quotes to show that. So if I say refresh, let's put this over a little bit. It will now put 5/23/2018 at 2:35:05 p.m. We can change this, as we said later. We'll go ahead and add that in differently for what is today. But for right now, this is a date that we are using. So hopefully that gave you some ideas of how we're going to be playing with our dates. Come back for session 3 and we will keep going with some more JavaScript.